What's up, everybody? Welcome to the second episode of the Beyond Train podcast. I'm your host, Leah Dalton. Today, we have an episode on the history of the germ theory. Now, this is going to be my hypocrite episode, as I mentioned in the last episode, because we're going to be talking about what we're against here. Um, I certainly don't want this podcast to revolve around dismantling the germ theory. I think that dead horse has been beat enough, and we really need to move this theory forward. However, for the purpose of this podcast, moving forward, I do want to set a foundation, and that involves dismantling the germ theory a little bit. I think it's good to talk about it. I think it's good to talk about it truthfully, honestly. We want to avoid any straw man arguments here. So certainly, if you want to point that out, please let me know, and we could certainly have a discussion about that because I do really want to avoid that. I want to be truthful and honest in recounting this history to the best of my knowledge. I've received, this type of lecture many times in my university career, uh, especially about the history of the germ theory. It seems to be told in every biology and microbiology class that I take over and over again for some reason. But we're going to do it here. We're going to put a little twist on it, a little twist of criticism. Uh, so let's get right into the episode. We'll talk about what's on the agenda today. We're going to go over some housekeeping. We're going to touch on a little bit of the symbolism of the change in kind of the medical establishment symbols over time. We're going to talk about the history. That'll be the bulk of the episode. Then we're going to go in some techniques like viral filtration, also known as false isolation. We'll talk about discrepancies there, microbial isolation. We'll talk about the electron microscope. We'll talk about the literature and how it's polluted. I love talking about that. We'll talk a little bit about pharmaceutical drugs, such as antibiotics and vaccines, as well as why we have a perceived contagion. Why have we come to this conclusion of contagion? Why is disease contagious? And lastly, we'll touch on why this is a widely accepted dogma, and then we'll introduce the next podcast. So, some housekeeping notes. Uh, we're gonna start by talking a little bit about the rise of materialism in science. Now, I really think that this is central to science's problems. Um, Not that when spirituality and science were merged together, it didn't cause problems, because often religious dogma was intertwined with science, which posed many, many issues, of course. But that was pretty much just it was still the establishment just kind of taking advantage of the scientific community. This is not necessarily a new thing in the last 150 years, although it seems to be worse because of the rise of materialism and how many people in the world are are not spiritual or even religious or in any respect, and they think that everything is material or pleasure based, and that really exacerbates the gap between our connection to nature and our connection to true science. And so I think it's really important that we get rid of that materialistic mindset. And this is something that I'll be talking a lot about, um, and again, another thing that I love to harp on is the victim mindset versus responsibility. I really think the germ theory of disease is all about the victim mindset, and because it's just a random occurrence versus being responsible for our health. We don't blame these little particles floating through the air for our disease. We take responsibility and look at where we're lacking nourishment or perhaps being poisoned. So I think that's important. That's an important lens to look at this, and this kind of ties into even when I was mentioning that just because science and spirituality have been merged before doesn't mean that it makes everything go away, because when the church was prevailing, disease was said to be caused by sin, oftentimes, and that came with its own presenting issues, such as selling the cures as a subscription to the church or whatever it may be. Uh, so really, the point that should be made is that we need to avoid this victim mindset. Disease is not random. We really need to take responsibility for our health here. Another note I have here is that immunology really is just vaccinology now. It's so centered around vaccines. Anything about the immune system really just has to do with pathogens, and vaccines is really the major point here. And I guess the cures as well, like antibiotics and things of that matter, because every microbiology or virology course that I took in my undergrad was less centered around studying microbes and more centered around studying cures or preventative vaccines or things of that nature. And this research is obviously pushed and funded by the pharmaceutical companies, so that's the vested interest there is pretty great. The next thing is virus hunting. That's been around for a little bit now. Really started in the AIDS days because of the electron microscope coming to light. Anthony Fauci is one of the most well-known virus hunters. He's been hunting for viruses for a very long time. Back in the AIDS days, his life work, was revolved around AIDS at the time. And when that started to die down and there was less money in it, he was actually beginning to look for a viral disease of cancer. And he really, really pushed for that. Not that that's necessarily an absurd place to look per se. Obviously, within science, it's great to look at as many places as possible, but we need to omit our own biases and subjectivity towards science. So this infectious disease hunting has been going on for a very long time. For some reason, infection and contagion sells, right? And I think this is because it's really easy to propagate fear, and it's really easy to sell cures. And if you take the responsibility away from the individual, it's much easier to sell them a cure because you disconnect them from their body, and thus they're disconnected from their healing processes. And so they trust the third party to sell them some snake oil to make them better. And this is a tale really as old as time. So the thing is about modern science is, we're kind of told these half truths, right? So we're told that microbes cause disease. Now, the reason this is kind of a half truth is because microbes are certainly a part of disease. They're part of our natural healing process. They're part of nature. They're part of that alchemical transformation into health from disease. Now, this is true of most science, especially pretty much all of modern science, especially everything that's false, is we're told these half truths, right? Um, and like I mentioned earlier, this is my hypocritical episode, so please don't hate me or criticize me too much for that. At least I acknowledge it. Um, I have a little saying here, you shouldn't hate war, you should love peace. And I certainly spent a lot of time hating the germ theory, but now I'm kind of just loving true healing and understanding the true powertrain, and it's certainly working out better for my health. So this podcast is all about saying about what we're for, not what we're against. Again, this episode is it's kind of what we're against, but we will touch on some powertrain aspects of things. And it's really, really important that we look at this history as a whole. Um, so even the parts that are for the germ theory, it's important to know it. It's important to understand it, because without understanding it, you can't really have a conversation about it. So I truly think it's important to look at things as a whole, and we're gonna do our very best to avoid the straw man logical fallacy here. I don't want to build up these germ theory arguments to be less than they are. I really tried to pull the most important parts of it out to discuss it truthfully. Now, of course, I do have my own biases, right? So that should be taken into account. But I definitely encourage people to look into it for themselves, especially the claims of the Koch's postulate studies that we'll be making and how Koch's postulates have never been attained. I really think that's a good thing for people to look into, because when you look at the studies critically, you'll realize that there's very little evidence for many of these things, and so really it comes down to doing your own research. I'm here. I'm trying to provide the best possible explanation of things here, but definitely doing your own research is the best way to kind of prove things to yourself, anyways. So that being said, we're going to move on to some symbolism here. So originally, medicine was symbolized by the rod of Asclepius, and this was said to be the staff of Moses with one snake, importantly, going around it. And this has been the symbol through time. Um, and the symbolism kind of represents that the snake contains the venom and the anti-venom. So the snake representing the person um, has the capabilities of becoming diseased, but also has the healing capabilities within them too. And this single snake can regenerate itself. Now, the symbol of Asclepius, he was the son of Apollo, and this certainly signified a natural healing, a self-healing. And this symbol was infected by the worst germ known to man, which was greed. Now we move over to the newer symbol of medicine, and that's the caduceus. And this is where there are two snakes around one staff, one um, centerpiece. And this really disconnected the body from the natural healing processes. And this is important, right? Because when you separate the body being able to be diseased and the healing processes from it, uh, that's where you can come in and sell the snake oil, right? That's where you can come in and sell this stuff. So that's a really important distinction. You're outsourcing your healing to an external agent, and that's certainly gonna cause issues. I got light in my face here, and there's a bear coming across. It's a little distracting, but um, so this is the truly the symbol of Mercury here, or Hermes. Um, and this is the alchemical signal. Now, this symbol is meant to signify commerce, merchants, trade, alchemy, liars, and thievery. And it's not necessarily an inherently bad symbol, although it's portrayed poorly here. It's just not an appropriate symbol for medicine. So now alchemy is tied into this, and because it is the symbol of the alchemical transformation. And that may be a discrepancy in describing healing as an alchemical transformation. Uh, and that's a great argument. But I would certainly say that the alchemical transformation itself is not necessarily associated with the known version of alchemy, right? Because alchemy through time was kind of the snake oil, was kind of the thieves and the liars and the merchants, because they would sell their fake gold, right? Because when people really tried to turn lead into gold, they ended up making things like brass or things that looked like gold and trying to pass it off as real gold. So this is why there's that thievery associated with it. Um, so it's not necessarily a bad symbol, right? Because it depicts the triad, it depicts so many things here. But it's just not appropriate for medicine, for healing, I suppose, is how I would go about it. So we're going to move into talking a little bit about the history of germ theory, and I think it's appropriate to kind of touch on the church or organized religion uh, as kind of the perpetuator of this idea. Uh, because the church being involved in medicine and healing is kind of just the same thing as the governmental agencies and larger medical establishments or elites being involved in healing now, because the church were the ones who funded the hospitals or other charitable institutions. They funded the medical professionals, physicians, nurses back in the day. So you always need to follow the money to understand the root of everything and look at the intentions of the funders rather than the fundees, because it always relies on who is paying the money at the end of the day. Now, the church had a major impact on medical education and the practice of medicine, of course, because they were the ones with the money and the power, right? So they could kind of regulate things, and and that always comes with its own issues, right? So the medical schools in Europe were established by the church, of course. They developed their medical theories and practices, and of course, this was really dogmatic, right? So some of their doctrines were illness was often caused by sin or moral failing. So this was the creation of disease, right? This was the you know, shaming the individual, uh, instilling them with fear, instilling them with hopelessness. And then, of course, promoted their spiritual and religious practices, and especially the help from their physicians, healed and, or trained in the proper healing techniques in their mind to remove the body of sin or moral failing and, um, remove the disease from them. And this was kind of their method of selling the cure, right? So going to church, you were expected to donate a certain amount of money by going, and obviously that would be a practice that was very pushed by these healing practitioners that, if you're a sinner, you need to go to church. So um, that's an important distinction. That's kind of the tale as old as time, and we could get into the talk of the Knights Templars. I'm not well versed in that conversation. I've read and watched videos of a few people who are, and I do want to reach out and maybe talk about that history a little more. I find it very interesting, very interesting. Um, but really, like another important thing about them being involved in this was the suppression of conflicting discoveries, right? So even it's told that the modern ways of medicine now were suppressed by the church back in the day because they didn't want to give up their own, create the disease, sell the cure process. Um, and of course, this involved persecution of practicing physicians outside of the church's views, and this just inhibits true progress in science. And it's the same story today. It's just the same story over and over again. And that's why I thought it was important to bring this up. And certainly this was very brief, and we could go into it a lot more, and perhaps we will down the road here, because I do love the history of science and religion. Okay, now we have Girolamo Fracastoro, and he was alive in the 1400s, 1476 to 1553 to be exact. And he was the first germ theorist. To be exact, his theory was the seeds of disease. He wrote the book De Contagione e Contagiosis Morbis, or On Contagious and Contagious Disease. I'm sure my Latin's absolutely terrible. Um, so Fracastoro proposed that diseases were caused by tiny particles that could be transmitted from one person to another. And this is way back in the day, right? So it's not like the idea of contagion is necessarily new, but when you read this, when you read his work, he's not necessarily talking about microbes, right? It could certainly be interpreted as a toxic chemical. And originally, the term virus actually meant poison, right? So the word virus is not new. It's not new in the last 50 years since the electric microscope was invented. Virus has been around for a long time, and it actually meant poison. So people have been talking about viruses for a long time, not in reference to this new age idea of it. Um, so Fracastoro thought that microorganisms became pathogenic in animals' heat. Uh, so that's why animals received the disease and perhaps not plants. And he was the first to mention the word syphilis in his poem, Syphilis, or the French disease. That's the origin of that word, which is just a little fact. So in the 1600s, 1632 to 1723. Antoine Van Leeuwenhoek, I'm sure you've heard of this if you've taken any science class in your life. He invented the microscope. He discovered microorganisms, him and Robert Hooke. He discovered these microorganisms in water, dental plaque, and other materials. Suggested that these microorganisms could play a role in disease. And he was mostly objectively viewing the microorganisms. He didn't really propose any theories that, these were causative factors for disease. But M.A. Plenses put forth a germ theory of disease in 1762 after Leeuwenhoek's life. And this was based on his observations, Leeuwenhoek's observations through the microscope, and proposed that these were infectious agents transmitted through the air. So again, this idea of contagion coming to light. So then next on the list, we have Edward Jenner. For the sake of chronology, I'm kind of presenting this as these people were alive. And so Edward Jenner was alive in the 1700s, 1749 to 1823, the inventor of the smallpox vaccine. And so his way of figuring this out was that he noticed milkmaids who had cowpox were not getting smallpox. So his idea was that he took the pus from a cowpox lesion, injected it into a boy named James Phipps, a young boy. So obviously, very, very unethical um, experiment, which is kind of a double standard in my mind, because a lot of other unethical experiments, especially in psychology, are uh, are shamed. But his story, I find, wasn't as shamed in my university career, at least because of of the miracle of a vaccine, right? And so what happened when he did this? Phipps developed a mild case of cowpox, but did not develop smallpox when later exposed to the disease. And so in Jenner's mind, this demonstrated that cowpox was providing protection against smallpox. Now, in Jenner's work, there were certainly no controls. There was certainly no isolation of any microorganism. And it's a very interesting observation. Sure, I'm not disagreeing with that. Uh, but it's not necessarily the same concept of vaccines either, because you're using different pathogens. Now, they may have the argument may be that they have similar endotoxins or spike proteins is a big buzzword now. But the pus that he would have transferred from the cowpox serum would have contained a plethora of other agents too, right? From it just goes down to pretty much anything could be in there at that point, especially in the diseased part of the body. Certainly a concentration of dead tissue with likely a presence of toxins would be there, right? Uh, so prior to doing vaccines, some would drip smallpox or cowpox pus into their lesions willingly to protect themselves. So it was kind of a form of a natural vaccine in their minds. And I find this really interesting more so than anything because this is not necessarily an absurd thing. I think it's probably a good thing to expose yourself to as many microorganisms as possible from birth. The idea that we need to shelter babies and put them in incubation chambers so they don't die instantly of a microorganism is a little ridiculous in my mind. It certainly doesn't help the development of the true natural healing process of the body. And I think this is a major problem with vaccines, as we'll touch on later, because they provide a kind of a false immunity for an individual. But we'll get into that more because it's kind of a bigger discussion than just that statement. So next year we have Louis Pasteur. He was born in 1822 to 1895, and Louis Pasteur, and not enough can be said about this gentleman here. He, in his mind, proved microorganisms were responsible for fermentation and putrefaction. However, this was proven by Antoine Béchamp years before. Louis Pasteur was also touted for disproving spontaneous generation, again, previously proven by Antoine Béchamp years before. And so he was basically just a serial plagiarist of Béchamp, who was kind of his, they said that they were kind of enemies in the field, right? Béchamp opposed much of Pasteur's work, but Pasteur tended to take on everything that Béchamp was doing. The reason that Pasteur has so much notoriety is because he was more of a politician than a scientist, whereas Antoine Béchamp really dedicated his life to science and studying, and it can be seen in his work, certainly. And we'll touch on more of Antoine Béchamp and his work in the next podcast, which is going to be the history of the terrain model of health. But for now, we're going to kind of focus more on Louis Pasteur. And if you want to look in more into Louis Pasteur being a plagiarist, Ethel D. Hume wrote a book, Béchamp or Pasteur, probably the most phenomenal read you could do on the subject, especially when it comes to Pasteur versus Béchamp. She recounts it very well, and it's well cited and referenced in the Annales de Chimie, and all of the literature back in the day was all published, all letters and things like that. So it's very well referenced. Uh, it's an absolute fact. There's no doubt in my mind that Louis Pasteur was a plagiarist and an imposter. and a fraud as well, which is the subtitle of that book. Okay, so yeah, Louis Pasteur proposed microbes could be the cause of infectious disease. So this was kind of the big one for him. They call him the father of the germ theory. He thought that there was a microbe for every disease, and thus he thought that there was a vaccine for every disease. And I really think that this was the reason he pushed it so much. Another thing that we highly dislike Louis Pasteur for is the creation of pasteurization, the worst thing known to the human diet. And he did it, of course, in the name of food safety. Now, this allowed for mass farming to become a thing. It allowed for, hundreds or thousands of dairy cows to all produce milk and to go in one single holding tank, and it matters not the quality of the milk because it all gets homogenized together. So if there's pus in the milk, it matters not because it's all in one big holding tank. And yeah, there may be some microbes that make your stomach upset in that, but since we pasteurize it, we can kind of mask the toxicities, which is the reasons the microbes were there in the first place, and feed it to us anyways, which in turn we end up being the cattle. And like I mentioned, Louis Pasteur was a mediocre chemist and a fantastic politician, and that's his rise to fame. He had ties with the Emperor of France at the time, Emperor Napoleon III. And of course, there's a large possibility for vested interests there. It's claimed that he's an admitted fraud. There's no direct evidence of him ever saying the quote that germ is nothing and the terrain is everything. It is said that he mentioned this on his deathbed, saying Antoine Béchamp is right, or maybe he said Bernard is right, which was who Antoine Béchamp based his work on. But there's no record of it. It's in a book. It's in many books, and you can look into this. It's just not something that I'd rely on for the truth here. Not that it's absolutely necessary to the truth at all, but I find that this is a kind of a discrediting thing in this community. If people say that Louis Pasteur said this, I think that's problematic because it kind of discredits the work that we're doing. And sorry, not necessarily that I'm doing. I mean, we're as in the people on the forefront here, but it kind of discredits this movement of the terrain model of health because it's not necessarily an absolute truth, and I think it's important to stick to that. Now, he is a fraud and he is an imposter, though. There's no doubt about that. His personal journals were leaked by, I think, not a stepson, but maybe like a step nephew or something like that. It was kind of far removed. But he leaked his personal journals, in which he had fraudulent data around his vaccine trials. Um, so of course, Louis Pasteur's data was was just fraudulent, which of course has no place in true science. And there were many accounts that Pasteur killed or produced disease into entire herds through his vaccines, and farmers were not very happy about this. There's a lot of that in the book by Ethel Hume. Okay, we're gonna shift a little bit here, but we're still in the history of things. I'm gonna provide a little information on the American Medical Association, also known as the AMA. I'll probably refer to it as that. Um, Now, I'm presenting this now just in the for the sake of chronology. So the American Medical Association, the AMA, was established in 1847. Its original purpose was to document birth, deaths, and marriages. So, this is a whole other issue, of course, more governmental than medical. Obviously, there's many things involved in why this is important. Uh, because a major argument that we hear all the time is that people live so much longer now. The average lifespan is so long. Well, we only have data going back to 1847, and if you have no trust in any story at all, in any story by any native group in the world, or even going back past Hippocratic times or back to Egyptian times, You wouldn't believe that someone were to live over 100 years, right? Because, oh, well, everyone died at 30, right? But this is mostly a problem of the West, because many died in combat or died, for various unsanitary conditions or whatever it may be. No doubt that people died earlier in the West through history, but it's certainly not the case that people didn't live over 100 years old. There are stories of people living much, much longer than that in some indigenous circles as well, especially the indigenous of North America, whose history is a little closer of them being kind of untouched and purely living in nature. So one thing that this did was it kind of discounted all those stories. I think that's one of the major problems. Obviously, it infringes on our sovereign rights of birth, death, and marriage. I'd like to die and just be buried under a tree somewhere rather than having to go and do all of this document work, right? It's not a very peaceful send off. Same with birth, it needs to be recorded and all of this stuff needs to go in, and it's just not right in my mind. Same as a marriage. The government has no business in people's true marriage, and obviously now there's an incentive to be married if you're living in the new world. Not saying that, but archetypally, a marriage is between a man and a woman, and not uh, certainly not man, woman, and government. So that's an important distinction. Um, okay, moving forward here, that was a little bit of a tangent, but in 1849 to 1906, the establishment of the Board of Investigates for Quackery was established by the medical AMA there. And this was to investigate things like herbology, massage, homeopathy, any Eastern medicines, and pretty much any natural medicines. Of course, the release of the Journal of the AMA was in 1883 to kind of document this. And this was kind of the start of pushing out these natural ways to make way for the new emerging field of pharmaceuticals. And you can kind of see how in the later end of Pasteur's life, how the AMA was starting to be created, right? And it was kind of the start of the snowball. And you can really see this through here. And this information, of course, is taken from the AMA website, so it's not like it's some quack making this up either. But basically, the JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, promoted scientifically tested pharmaceutical drugs was a major part of it, and of course, monopolized the field. So in 1897, the AMA incorporated, and of course, we love corporations in our medical models. And so now the compulsory smallpox vaccine came out in 1899, just after the AMA incorporated. Next was 1906, the American Medical Directory was established. And in 1907, the AMA involved the Carnegie Foundation, obviously funded and ran by Andrew Carnegie. Touch on him more in a second here. And in 1910, an extremely significant thing happened for the medical establishment. The Flexner Report was released by Abraham Flexner. And I have a little quote from the AMA website here. The Flexner Report, Medical Education in the United States and Canada, funded by the Carnegie Foundation and supported by the American Medical Association, is published and facilitates new standards for medical schools. So the target was not just to necessarily get information out to we the people or to practitioners, but was certainly to monopolize schools as well. And so we're going to touch on the Flexner Report a little bit here. And this is taken from the Flexner Report itself, but it was completely funded by the Carnegie Foundation. And keep that in mind. So the Flexner Report essentially provided medicine with reconstruction and regulation of medical education. It provided it with pharmacology as the only solution to disease, and I quote here, the need for pharmacology are in these respects not different from those of physics. And I'll just let you guys think about that one there. Not much needs to be said about that quote, is pharmaceuticals just as necessary in physics as health? Well, you can answer that question. And it also established the fact that funding is paramount to medical education. And funding, of course, at this time was unregulated. Anybody could fund anything they want. There was no real investigation. And not that there necessarily is now. There's certainly ways to get around it, but it's fully unregulated. So that tells you something. And the idea of funding being important is because in doing research, it was expensive, and especially to do the trials that the AMA was requiring, it became more expensive. And so this kind of monopolized the field that your average Joe wasn't able to go out and just, do observations or, do science, right? It had to be funding, it had to be funded, it had to be approved, it had to be all this stuff, right? Not that that's necessarily an absurd concept either, just that this is what it was at the time. I have another quote here from the Flexner Report, and it states that the human body belongs to the animal world. It is liable to attack by hostile physical and biological agencies. And only chemical drugs are able to stop these attacks, is kind of the notion that they were getting at. Uh, so they really, really were just pushing the idea of pharmaceuticals, right? So all prevention, they didn't really talk about vaccines as much in the Flexner Report. I think that was probably a smart play on their own part, because it doesn't look that good going back. But their idea of prevention was in sanitary conditions, which is also a major advancement for disease, I think, in some respects, obviously, without the use of chemicals, but not living in your own waste is a good idea for your health. Um, Now, one thing about the Flexner Report I will say is that Abraham Flexner killed Hippocrates. And Hippocrates was the only thing that the West really had going for them. Not that bloodletting is the best way forward, and not that it's necessarily absurd either. This is not a debate on that. But Hippocrates certainly had a greater understanding of the body. I can understand the shortfalls of the humors and his theory put forth there. But you know, Abraham Flexner stated in the Flexner Report that, Hippocrates just wasn't enough, and that his ideas it kind of just discounted Hippocrates as a person and physician and a historic figure. Um, and obviously now doctors don't even say the Hippocratic Oath anymore, which can be problematic symbolically. But Hippocrates certainly had some good ideas, and had some very good quotes, and I took a history of the body, or history of modern medicine, birth of the body, and we talked a lot about Hippocrates in that course. I took it in university, and really Hippocrates was not far off. I'm not going to say that he's the best physician to ever exist, but he certainly thought that the idea of a doctor being a connect, like, his theory was there. He thought that the physician should be, you know, in it for the healing and part of the healing process, but understood that the body is the primary healer in the situation. I think that is the most significant thing that and he understood things like all disease starts in the gut, or um, you know, this is a good one too. You live off 1/3 of the food you consume, and your physician off the later 2/3. I thought that one was good too. Speaks about the gluttony in our society now too. Yeah, so all preventative medicine was obviously centered around bacteriology in the Flexner Report, and all pathology was taught as being microbes as the causative agent. Now, to continue with the AMA here, we're going to talk about Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie, and his relationship to Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller. So Carnegie was, touted as the second richest man in the world, and he did this off of steel and railroads. So that was kind of his business, right? Second richest man in the world at the time, I would say, in the mainstream lens. Now, Rockefeller, rich from oil, was the richest man in the world at the time. People say he was perhaps the richest man in history, and I would say probably in mainstream history. Obviously, there are people that are more powerful and more rich beyond these two fellows. But these guys were really at the forefront of things, and perhaps at the time they were really at the top, maybe especially in the new Western world, North America. Abraham Flexner, of course, was employed by the Carnegie Foundation, and he was later the first director of the Rockefeller philanthropy programs in medical education. So they all had great ties together. I think Abraham Flexner's brother worked for the Rockefeller Foundation as well. So they really all had some great ties with each other. So it's not like Abraham Flexner, who first of all was not, you know, maybe he wasn't a great person for the Flexner Report. Perhaps it should have been a board of people, but he certainly had ties with some very powerful, rich people. And it's interesting that Rockefeller, who rich from oil, it's important, is greatly involved in medical research and education systems as philanthropy. And now this is important because, these lines are these oil lines, these oil families are still, they're still up there. And there's a lot derived from petroleum for very cheap. And I'll give you an incomprehensive list here. Things such as plastics, synthetic fibers, pharmaceutical drugs, food additives, cosmetics, cleaning supplies, pretty much any complex organic chemical, are mostly derived from petrol. So I think that's a really important thing to consider, right? And so why are these guys doing these philanthropy, right? Oh, they're just good people. They have so much money. Well, philanthropy equals tax write-off. And that's pretty much just the case. If you see like a very rich person doing philanthropy, I'm sure they're benefiting from it in somehow. Yeah, well, one, it's a tax write-off. Two, it likely allows them to travel or focus most of their time on something less stressful than work. And you can certainly see that now. So don't be tricked by philanthropy. That is a great disguise that rich people use. It's just a tax write-off for the most part. They're saving more money than anything. They could probably buy a jet through their philanthropy associations because they need to travel for conferences. And that jet is then a tax write-off. And then they have complete access to a private jet. So this is how that type of stuff works. But that's for another podcast down the road when we talk about money, financial freedom. And so my last kind of aside in the history of this is the public education. So Rockefeller created the General Board of Education in 1902. This was meant to move people away from agricultural knowledge to industrial knowledge because, well, John D. Rockefeller's very well known for saying, I don't want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers, because obviously the Industrial Revolution was on the cusp and they needed workers, they did not need farmers. So, and I think if I'm remembering this correctly, don't quote me on this, but back in the 1900s, 95% of America produced food for 5% of America. And now I think it's the reverse, 5%, less than 5% produces the food for the other 95%. So what did Rockefeller do well? He did that very well. He moved agriculture knowledge away to industrial knowledge. And so Rockefeller's education advisor, Frederick Taylor Gates, wrote The Country School of Tomorrow. And in that, he wrote, we shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or science. And if that doesn't tell you about the education system, I don't know what will. And Frederick Taylor Gates is not related to Bill Gates. Obviously, we looked that up, but it's not true. Okay. So again, 1905, Carnegie established the foundation for the advancements of teaching. So these guys were great friends, great business friends. They obviously, Rockefeller needed Carnegie to move his oil around, and Carnegie needed Rockefeller to move his trains. So these philanthropic foundations, among the medical foundations, were just tax deductions. And the benefit you could see is the control of an absolute population still to today. So it was obviously a big plan, much larger than, Rockefeller's life. The Rockefeller Foundation also donated $500 million to the educational system. So follow the money and you will find the truth. And I'm going to tell a little bit of a story here. Um, I was once putting in some docks, for boats, right? And we're working here and we're putting these docks in, and we have a farmer who's helping us with the tractor, and we have a fisherman helping us with the boat, right? So the farmer would kind of take him and put him in the water, put the docks in the water using his tractor, and the fisherman would take him out. And farmers and fishermen, they don't really like each other too much. There's kind of a feud there, especially where I'm from, in Prince Edward Island. But pretty much any small town, I'm sure, if there's farmers and fishermen, they don't necessarily get along. Um, and you can certainly see that, right? Because they wanted to yell at each other and tell each other what to do. And the funny thing was, the farmer, we had a moment and we were chatting, and what he said to me was, he says, us farmers and fishermen, we don't always get along, and we're trying to tell each other what to do here. He keeps yelling at me, you know, do this, do that, and he says, I'm not gonna do any of that. He says, whose orders I'm gonna follow? I'm gonna follow whoever's name's at the bottom of that check. And that story just stuck with me. And that what he said there, it could not be more true. And here's this farmer, just dropping a very, very valuable point of wisdom, right? Whoever signs the name on the check calls the shots. I don't care if it's philanthropy. I don't care if you have a trust. I don't care. You call the shots. If you have the money, you call the shots. And that's a very, very important thing to understand, especially when it comes to any type of establishment at all, right? Because we're really focused on establishments here, not necessarily individuals. Obviously, these individuals are kind of the ones who've established these establishments, so that's why we're talking about it. But um, when we talk about these things like medical associations, it's not about doctors. It's about medical establishments, because ignorance is bliss. All right, moving back to a more scientific history of germ theory, we got Robert Koch, 1843 to 1910 was his rather short life. Um, and so he was touted for a few things. He used stains in microscopy to increase visibility of the microbes, stains being heavy metals, which comes with its own problems, which we'll discuss in a bit. He discovered the causative microbes for tuberculosis in 1882, supposedly discovered. He wrote the etiology of tuberculosis. So pure culture in this sense kind of refers only to the presence of one strain of bacteria, not pure in its true sense. So it's important when reading these things that we understand this, like their definitions of purity or isolation are skewed for sure. Because although one strain of bacteria might be present in his Koch's postulate studies, which we're about to go over, there are other contaminations certainly there. And so I quote from the etiology of tuberculosis: single tubercles or particles about the size of a millet seed are quickly cut out of the lung tissue from a diseased guinea pig or human and immediately carried over to the surface of solidified serum in a test tube. Right? So these serums used were cow or sheep's blood, agar agar, nutrient plates, things like that. And so it's important to know that, there's contaminations. You're not, you know, these tubercules are likely small little concentrations of toxins or dead tissues, right? So it's not necessarily enough to just have that culture. So there is a little bit of a problem in his work. I mean, his work is kind of incomprehensive, especially when you're reading about it. Like it certainly doesn't have the IMRAD format that we have now, which is a beneficial format. And that's a major problem with a lot of these old works, right? They don't really describe the isolation procedures. And we know that the isolation procedures have just gotten better over time, in quotations, isolation being used very loosely in that sentence there. But the problem with his work is that there was no control, there was no replication of natural transmission pathways, only inoculation would ever show results. And again, there's presence of contamination. although there's just one strain of bacteria, there's contamination, likely known as adjuvants, but we'll get on that more in a second here too. So basically, this etiology of tuberculosis was mostly paper on microbe visualization and disease symptom descriptions, more so than an actual satisfaction of Koch's postulates. So Koch's postulates, he developed them, of course, and they are a very logical approach. I have no problem with his postulates at all. I think they're extremely logical. I think they're a statement of true science. However, there's never been a paper that has satisfied Koch's postulates using a control relative to the experimental procedure. And the former is true without the later, more specific sentence that I added there. There has never been a paper that has satisfied Koch's postulates, period. There's especially never been done one with a relative control. So Koch's postulates, let's go over them here. Number one. So essentially, Koch's postulates is essentially a set of postulates used to decipher whether an infectious microbe or microorganism is the cause of a disease. So here are the postulates. Number one, the microbe must be present in all cases of the disease and absent in those without said disease. Secondly, the microorganism must be isolated from the host and grown in pure culture. Third, a sample of the culture must cause the same disease when inoculated into a healthy, susceptible host. And finally, the same microorganism must be re-isolated from the diseased host and match the profile of the original microorganism. So very logical. Like I said, I have no problem with this. The problem is in the implementation of this. It's in the scientific procedure, not lining up with the words and the true definitions of these words. And obviously, the first statement is kind of a great one. The microorganism must be present in all cases of disease and absent in those without said disease. Asymptomatic carriers, obviously, is a major, major fallacy and more supportive of the terrain model. But we're going to also touch on that later. I won't get ahead of myself here. So, obviously, in implementing Koch's postulates, it was a rather difficult task to do. Although people claim that they've done it, uh, it's still a tough thing. And some people did acknowledge that there were shortfalls. Like they took out obviously the asymptomatic carrier statement, right? Like they took out the and absent in those without said disease once we started getting into the AIDS debacle because asymptomatic carrier, that's kind of when that was invented. So they obviously had to change the definition to fit their dogma. And so Tomas Rivers was a guy who kind of he repostulated Koch's postulates. So Rivers was around 1888 to 1962. He worked as a vaccinologist in the early 1900s and implemented vaccines and other medical procedures in the military. And this was around 1915. Wonder why there was so much disease in military people. He reviewed Koch's postulates, created new postulates for viruses in 1924. Essentially, sorry, I shouldn't say it was for viruses. He did repostulate it and spoke about how Koch's postulates were a little bit too logical. Sorry, okay, I'll interject my own feelings here. He spoke out about how Koch's postulates were too hard to implement in scientific study, and so he decided to create his own set of postulates because it was difficult to apply Koch's postulates, especially to viruses. So Koch's postulates were too restrictive in his mind and needed to prove were not needed to prove causality of disease from microbes. So this is where we really lost our logic here. Rivers, I don't agree at all with his new postulates, which we'll go over after the slide here. And Rivers was a big one for the monomorphism versus polymorphism debate. So things like polymorphism, pleomorphism, or the somatic cycle of microbes is a big part of the Perry model of health. And he was basically the one that banned the use of polymorphism in the scientific literature, likely with the help of the AMA. And funny enough, like we never mentioned Thomas Rivers in my whole university career. I never heard of him. And I definitely heard of Koch's postulates time and time again, and said how many times we've satisfied that, even though many people in the literature kind of discredit Koch's postulates as not being enough. So it's funny because in university we teach Koch's postulates, but then in the real literature we kind of admit that it's what Rivers said here. It's not necessary to prove causality from disease. However, we teach it in every university course on microbiology or even biology in general. So I think that's a real problem. Like I heard Robert Koch's name so many times, it was unbelievable. Never, not one mention of Rivers. So there's a lack of teaching history as a whole, obviously, because the truth is in the history when you look at history truthfully. So Rivers' review of Koch's postulates. Essentially, you need to isolate the microbe from the disease host, cultivate the virus or microbe in host cells. The virus needs to have a proof of filterability, so it needs to be filtered, which is not isolation. There needs to be a production of a comparable disease when the cultivated virus is used to infect experimental animals. It must be re-isolated from the same virus from the infected experimental animal, and then there must be a detection of a specific immune response to the virus. So that's Rivers' postulates. They are a little less logical than Robert Koch's because isolation is the tough words here, right? So what do Koch and Rivers have in common? Well, both of their postulates have never been attained. Rivers' postulates have, even though they're easier, they've never been attained because the problem is that no true isolation is ever done in real scientific experiments, in real life, right? So there's never relative controls used. There's a lack of papers that do all four or all six postulates in a single experiment or paper. They often outsource their methods. The example I have here is steps 1 and 2 of Koch's postulates were done in said study, uh, which is not necessarily problematic. It's just that when you go back to read those studies, they didn't necessarily isolate anything either. So and then so you basically go from vague descriptions of methods like Koch, Jenner, Pasteur, to these outsourced papers who really just don't isolate anything in any of the papers. Contagion in vivo or in vitro has never been proven. Contagion is not something that's been proven to happen. And there's many accounts of this. One is Gallup's Island, which was done after like during the Spanish flu. I think it was 1918, where they took 100 military men to the island and had them spend a ton of time around sick people being coughed in their face, sneezed on right in their face. They had to put their nose in the diseased person's mouth and they breathe solely the diseased person's air into their nose or into their mouth. And not one of these military, they even ended up injecting people at the end with pus, or they took pus out of the throat. They went from real life kind of experiments to really fake ways of contagion and still couldn't prove contagion. This is a really interesting one because you can find it on Wikipedia. You can find it like kind of in the mainstream view of things. So Gallup's Island, I'd certainly look into that if it's a great place to start. It's short read too, but contagion's never been proven. Absolutely not. Epidemiology can't even show statistically relevant contagion. Epidemiology is just not a field that we need to be drawing any conclusions from. That's not its purpose. It's meant to generate hypotheses, not create facts. Epidemiology is the introduction. It's the foundation, not even the foundation. It's the preemptive work. That's a very important distinction. And so in vitro, only inoculation really shows any sort of contagion, although it's still incomplete and never satisfies Koch's or Rivers' postulates. Inoculation is really the only way that we can get disease to show or symptoms to show in people, but that's because we're not injecting pure virus or microbes. We're not injecting pure. We have adjuvants. We have these heavy metals in it to stimulate immune responses. That's what an adjuvant is. That's the purpose, and that's admitted in the mainstream view of things too. That's why you have aluminum and mercury in vaccines, because it's supposed to stimulate an immune response. That's the purpose of it. That's why it's there. Or sometimes it's a preservative as well, but I think it's mostly the adjuvants. So viruses specifically, have a little history here. And we're just gonna keep this brief because I probably bored you guys enough with this history of the germ theory. Dmitry Ivanovsky, 1884, discovered the first virus while studying tobacco plants affected by the mosaic disease. His conclusion was that the sap from infected plants remained infectious even after passing it through a filter that removed all the bacteria, suggests the presence of an invisible infectious agent. Now, Martinus Bejernik, 1892, confirmed Ivanovsky's conclusion and proposed the term virus to describe the novel infectious agent. Of course, virus, before it was used in this sense, was meant to depict the word poison. His findings were that viruses could only replicate inside living cells, and viruses are made by cells. That's very, very important. Viruses are made by cells. Wendell Stanley, 1935, crystallized the tobacco mosaic virus. His findings pretty much showed that there was it was composed of a nucleic acid RNA and a protein coat in a little vesicle, and it was made from the same materials as the cell. Another important distinction. 1931, electron microscopy was invented. This perpetuated the virus hunting and germ theory. Obviously, it's just, you know, just a big win for the germ theory to push that forward, because you can look at these artifacts and prove a lot of and prove in quotations a lot of things. And so improvement of viral isolation through improved filtration is another thing that was touted as a scientific advancement in virology. But again, filtration is not isolation. So let's look at filtration. Here are the steps of filtration. You have your sample preparation step, where you remove debris, cell debris, larger particles, and you basically centrifuge it. So then you set up the filtration. A membrane, essentially there's a membrane that's designed to retain viruses, allow smaller components to go through. So you've already got the large gone. Now you want the smaller stuff gone. So it holds onto the virus and everything, all the smaller stuff goes through. So then you have the virus filtration, where the filter retains the virus while allowing smaller molecules, proteins, and other contaminants to pass through. You then rinse and wash the membrane to remove any remaining non-viral particles or contaminants that may adhere to the filter. And then you essentially recover and confirm the presence of the virus from the filter. And you can confirm this through electron microscopy or polymerase chain reaction. And here's the real problematic step, is that then you need to culture the virus. And essentially, you have the cell culture medium, which is often vero cells, which are monkey kidney cells. And within this culture, there's often a fetal bovine or other animal serum. So vaccines are not necessarily a vegan per se, because that's in vaccines too. So all you vegans out there, stop taking vaccines. Um, and it's fetal bovine serum. So really, come on now. Not very ethical for all you people out there. Also in viral cultures are antibiotics and antimycotics. Antibiotics actually are known toxins to kidney cells, and interestingly, the cell culture medium, the most prominent one, is vero cells, monkey kidney cells. So that's interesting. Looking at Stefan Lanka's work there, Dr. Stefan Lanka did a control where he did this viral culture according to the steps of the modern ways, and produced viruses without actually inoculating the cell culture with a virus. So virologists hate Dr. Stefan Lanka for proving that. So as well in the viral culture is protease inhibitors, growth factors, cytokines, and pH indicators, chemicals, right? synthetic hormones, synthetic, it's just there's a lot in there, right? That's all in the viral culture. So you isolate it and then you cut it with a bunch of shit. It's ridiculous. So viral filtration is just a false isolation because, at the end, you have this sort of pure virus. You have a very small amount of it. It's never enough to produce any disease or symptoms in a person. They always say that the argument is that it's not enough. It's not enough virus to produce a disease, but aerosolized viruses can infect us, but their controlled manners can't. It's a foolish, absolutely illogical, irrational argument. It makes absolutely no sense. It's just ridiculous. Um, so here I have marked electron microscopy is not necessarily a differential process. Viruses look identical to exosomes. Andrew Kaufman's done a lot of work in that area. Dr. Andrew Kaufman, phenomenal source on exosomes. Obviously, he kind of started his work in the COVID era of things. Maybe he started before too. Regardless, he did a lot of work on exosomes, and how they're identical to viruses and how they're most likely just, our cells detoxing, to put it simply. Uh, Polymerase chain reaction. Oh, well, I could go on and on about the PCR being a test, a false test. But okay, so sorry, we'll stick with the viral filtration here. PCR only detects the presence. It does not detect species in isolation. So within viral filtration, you're not necessarily isolating viruses from different strands of viruses too, because a PCR test only detects the presence. It doesn't detect it being by itself, right? And so even through electron microscopy, you may have different strands of viruses. So it's kind of hard to tell if a virus, even in the mainstream view, which virus is it's just there's a lot of discrepancies there. Which virus is responsible? We can do a lot of stuff in silico in the computer with sequencing, with genomic sequencing, but there are many shortfalls in vitro or in vivo. The other major problem here is the addition of chemicals to the culture. There's just no chemical isolation. So you have this chemical concoction that then gets used in these Koch postulate studies. And, it's just problematic, because it's not true isolation. You know, there's not really a difference between virus and the tissue. The virus is kind of extension of the tissue. So viruses it's a very interesting thing because it's like we admit that it's created by the body, but we say that it's because we were infected when it's a tough argument. It's made by the body, right? So it kind of fits in with the terrain model of things too, how a virus may be more of a communication system or a detox system endogenously rather than and perhaps even to those around us. It's not like viruses don't come out when we cough, but we can't produce disease with small amounts of viruses in vivo or in vitro. It's never, ever been done. There's never even been claims of it being done. Uh, but you can stand next to someone at the grocery store and get sick in a matter of a few seconds, right? So there's a little bit of a discrepancy there. Obviously, there's the centrifugal step where you centrifuge it, where you spin it really fast. And this obviously causes a distortion. I don't think we really understand the implications, especially with something delicate as a small little virus like that. And I talked about Dr. Stefan Leika's control study with Vero cells and antibiotics, where he basically did the viral isolation step without inoculating the culture with a virus and produced viral particles anyway because antibiotics are toxic to kidney cells or yeah, kidney cells, Vero cells, monkey kidney cells, all the same thing. And so, even then, like you have all these adjuvants in Koch postulate. You have all of these things that are meant to stimulate the immune response in vaccines. I'm sure they're done in Koch postulate studies, right? So it's just a problem. So moving on here, we're going to go to bacterial isolation and its steps. So first, you start with inoculation. A sample, sorry here. A sample containing the mixed culture of bacteria is collected and inoculated into a solid growth medium such as agar and other additives, nutrients, and probably more chemicals. So then you then incubate this culture under the appropriate conditions, such as temperature, humidity, and oxygen levels. Control that. You then streak the culture. You basically spread the bacteria from the original inoculum onto an agar surface, which allows you to kind of pick out the bacteria from the specific colony that you want, right? So they're selected, streaked onto an agar plate, a new agar plate, to obtain a more pure culture of the specific bacterial species. And then you confirm it through microscopy, biochemical tests, and genetic analysis, which would be polymerase chain reaction. And then, of course, you take that final purified bacterial sample and you grow it in a pure culture. And this is essentially how we get how you get a pure bacteria. Now, I'm not going to necessarily deny that you have the presence of solely one bacteria because it can be confirmed through microscopy, which is a much different process than electron microscopy. But the problem is that in the culture is still the present. There's still present additives and chemicals and adjuvants, pH buffers, antibiotics, antimycotics, things that are toxic are still in this culture, right? So the problem is not that we can't isolate a bacteria per se, it's that we add all of this shit to be able to make it grow, right? Because bacteria only grow in these toxic conditions. These bacteria only flourish in these conditions. So if you want to have a virulent or a pathogenic bacteria, you need to provide it a toxic environment to be able to grow it. And what does that tell you about the germ theory disease? It certainly indicates that the terrain model is a whole lot more sound and logical in this case, um, because bacteria seek their innate environments. They want, they go where their food sources are. So that's an interesting observation, of course. I think it's a great point. I think it should be talked about more, obviously, but it's not. Um, and so, that bacterial isolation, it's good, then you culture it, and that's just a problem. That's the Koch's postulate studies again. And it's just not isolation. It's just not. It's a false isolation. It's a facade, and we trick ourselves essentially. And so another thing that we talked about a lot actually in my university career was the Great Plate anomaly. We don't understand the required environment to grow over 99% of bacteria in vitro. So this kind of states that, well, we know a whole lot less than we think we do. But there's a need for a natural environment when it comes to growing most bacteria or, fungus for that matter. There's a lot of fungus we can't grow in laboratories and things like that. The artificial environment does not equal the natural environment. That's a very important distinction. And we can't mimic nature perfectly. We can't. And so, we can't culture 99% of bacteria out there, but we're going to sit here and state that, we know which bacteria cause which diseases, and even worse, we know which viruses are causing these diseases as well. So it's like, it's a little ridiculous. Most microbes are sequenced in silico. That's how we claim to know as many bacteria as we do, but we can't culture 99% of them. So how the hell do you even study them in vitro? It's ridiculous. So there's so many problems in bacteriology and virology, especially in these isolation, because they'll sit here and say that they isolated the virus, but in the concoction of chemicals is a little bit of virus and a ton of other shit in it. So it's same with bacteria. So what do these two have in common? Viral transmission is viral transmission directly after filtration always fails to produce infection or disease. They claim that there's not enough virus in the sample. So if you took it directly from the filtration step without culturing it and put it into people, it never, ever, ever has once caused disease. No one's even claimed that it's caused disease. And I know I said that before, but that's so important. It's so important. Same as pure bacteria through natural routes always fail to produce disease and infection. Um, Injection most often used to produce desired results. Injection is always used if you want to produce desired results because you're using, you're injecting chemicals, not just the bacteria. And again, you're not taking the pure, if you grew the colony on an agar plate and perhaps that was the only additive that there was in there, like you could transmit this bacteria to someone and it would not produce disease. It's not enough. They always say it's not enough bacteria. We need more bacteria, or we need adjuvants. We need immune stimulators like heavy metals, or you know just a bunch of chemicals, right, to stimulate the immune system so you can get the symptom response that they're looking for, right? Because we think symptoms are disease. And of course, variables are not accounted for concerning Koch's postulates. There's never been a true isolation. Often the addition of adjuvants to produce desired results, such as heavy metals, are added. Can't stress that enough. It's also an ingredient in all the vaccines. Aluminum is a major one. And it's to stimulate the immune response, right? It's like this isn't even some woo-woo conspiracy thing. This is admitted in the literature. Adjuvant is admitted in the modern framework, right? You need adjuvants in vaccines, or else they say the vaccines don't work. Well, you know what? If you forced me to take a vaccine that was a pure bacteria or a pure virus and I could take it in a more natural route than an injection, I'm sure you'd have a lot of people lining up for that rather than, being injected with heavy metals, right? That's the real problem here. No one cares about getting injected, or well, many people don't like getting injection because it's an absolutely unnatural route. There's injections are just foolish. I don't care if it's an alternative practice. We shouldn't inject ourselves with things. Um, you know, but like there'd be an idea for a natural vaccine with pure bacteria, pure virus. It would be a whole lot more expensive. Obviously, it doesn't produce the toxic poisoning that is the real desired results of implementing vaccination, but that's another story. And I mentioned here, like in real life, contagion only requires a very small number of viruses or bacteria to produce infection and disease. But in vitro, in laboratory, even if you're mimicking it in vivo as closely as the natural, they can't produce it. They cannot produce contagion. Contagion has never been proven in any literature at all, at all. I will like if you can find a study that it has, please send it to me. I've scoured the literature for it and I can't find it. I know a lot of people who can't find it as well. And so, if you think that you found one, please send it my way. I'd love to read it and maybe we go over it because it has never been done. And, when it does try to get done, it never gets published. So they don't produce when they fail, or they don't publish literature when they fail, except for Gallup's Island. That's why that's an important study to go read. Okay, let's talk about the electron microscope. This basically furthered the fallacy of the mostly viruses, bacteria, not so much, although it furthered the fallacy of cell theory and the organelles within, but that's for the next podcast. Basically, the electron microscope allowed scientists to see correlative agents, namely viruses, at the site of disease where bacteria weren't present, right? So it kind of perpetuated that notion. It only looks electron microscopes. It's important to note that electron microscopes only look at dead, chemically stained, dehydrated, and frozen matter, right? And so the phenomenon is altered on so many levels, right? It's dead, first of all. It's chemically stained with heavy metals. Uh, it has no water. It's frozen. Like, it's so far from what a live tissue or sample is, right? So how do we know if dead tissue acts the same as live tissue, right? It kind of gives you artifacts. The electron microscope kind of gives you artifacts, right? And human beings certainly think that we can tell the entire story based off artifacts alone. Obviously, this comes from our study of history as well. We think we know everything about history because we have a few artifacts. We have artifacts in observations and we think that we understand the Big Bang. So it's kind of the same story through science, through, you know, all of this from Egyptians to viruses to the Big Bang. It's all just looking at artifacts and trying to pull a story out of our butt and and fool the people enough to push our dogmas and sell our cures. And it's the same story over and over again. History repeats itself. We learn from history that we do not learn from history. It's the best lesson you can learn. And so with the electron microscope, Harold Hillman was a guy who talked a lot about the fallacies of the electron microscope, proved things using angles, as well as, talking about the shortfalls of changing the state, killing it, staining it, dehydrating it, freezing it. And we'll touch on more of Harold Hillman's work in the next podcast as well. But yeah, the electron microscope really just pushes this egotistic, arrogant, kind of great deception. It really highlights that of not only the germ theory, but of society and modern science in general. We think we can tell every story, think we know everything. It's a foolish statement. So the electron microscope process, we'll go through this quickly here. Basically, you prepare the sample, you kill it, you freeze it, you dehydrate it, obviously. You cut the sample and section it into ultra thin sections of the sample because it needs light to go through it, so it needs to be extremely, extremely thin. You then mount it on a substrate material such as a copper grid or a glass slide. You then stain it using a contrast agent or stain to enhance visibility. And common stains, the most common stains are heavy metals such as uranium or lead. I don't know any person who'd want to have either of those in their body, but you then dry the sample, which prevents distortion during observation, distortion of the artifact. Electron microscope is nothing but a distortion, so that's an interesting explanation in my mind. And then you observe the sample. So the electron microscope uses a beam of electrons to create a highly magnified image of the sample, which can then be captured and analyzed. So you beam it with an extremely high frequency of electrons. That obviously is very good for a sample as well. Certainly wouldn't affect it at all. Now let's look at the limitations. Sample preparation. You're killing, cutting, freezing, drying, staining, dehydrating the sample because it has to withstand the vacuum conditions and high electron beam. Another problem with it is the cost. It's so inaccessible for people to really study this stuff in depthly. Like, if you're not up in the higher levels of universities or things like that, you're not using an electron microscope. So it's kind of hard to prove its fallacies. Another thing is it produces nothing but artifact images and distorted images. Um, you know, it's admitted that many times images get distorted in their sense due to beam damage, specimen drift, or charging effects. Obviously, electron microscopes have a limited sample size, very small samples. They're only two-dimensional, and limited sample types. It needs to be thin, flat, and stable. Anything out of this realm, and yeah, you can't look at it under the electron microscope. So it has its shortfalls, it has limitations, but we really, really, really rely on it for a lot of our theories nowadays. And I just think it's problematic to rely on it that much, especially when you're really altering the sample as much as you do in electron microscopy. So here we're going to talk a little bit about science's postulates. And this is kind of good science, right? So when you're doing something in science, you really want to try and prove what you're doing false. It needs to be, there needs to be an aspect of falsifiability. And this is important. It's something I feel like we've kind of got away from. So when I kind of got into the bioterrain medicine field for years, and still to this day, I still try to prove it false. And here's why this is a good part of science, because the more I tried to prove it false, the more I proved it correct in my mind, right? The more it became obvious, the more logic, I attributed to it. And with the germ theory, every day, I really tried to prove it correct. And the more I tried to prove it correct, the more it was obviously flawed in its entirety. So, falsifiability is important. Reproducibility, that's another thing, to be able to reproduce results. This has kind of gone by the wayside too. You don't see too much of this anymore because studies are expensive. This happened a lot in the earlier days, so it was kind of hard to get away with fudging the data. Obviously, if you had control of certain establishments, it was easier. Or you had ties, you had vested interests. So that's always been a thing. Look at the funding. Science should always be objective. We certainly put our biases into science. Even this lecture, obviously, I have my biases. I speak passionately about the germ theory being incorrect. I do truthfully think that it is incorrect, and I've looked at it objectively many, many times. And this is the importance of you going to look at it, right? Because obviously, like as objective as I try to stay, I was obviously more objective in my early days because I was coming from the modern framework of things. It's important to really look at things yourself objectively because then you can be honest with yourself. You don't know how honest other people are. You don't know how honest I'm being. You don't know how honest Anthony Fauci is being. You don't know how honest Louis Pasteur was. You don't know how honest all these other people are. Be honest with yourself and look into this stuff yourself. That's the important thing. Remain objective. And that's a tough thing to do, but it translates well in the rest of your life. Relevant controls and variables should be used in science. Um, Obviously, it's subjective what is relevant and what variables could be involved. But it's like if you take a rat and you're studying a rat in a plastic container, obviously you're not controlling variables of a natural environment. So there's like even in rat studies, these lab rats being bred and the stressful conditions that they're under artificial lights, LED lights, they're not getting sunlight, they're not getting all of these things, right? So it's just variables that are not controlled. Not to say that all these studies are absolutely useless, it's just that these variables aren't controlled, right? So it's kind of difficult. Um, when you observe things in its natural environment, that's great because you don't have to worry about variables because you're observing things in its natural environment. Obviously, if you're going to run, these studies or try and prove things or make theories, right? It's important to have these relevant controls, but when you're observing nature, if you observe the sun come up every day for your entire life, well, you can conclude that the sun's likely going to come up tomorrow. Now, I wouldn't take it for granted, but it's probably a logical conclusion to draw. And so in science, you have two types of studies, quantitative or qualitative. We've obviously gone by the wayside of qualitative studies, which are smaller scale, n equals small number, small sample sizes, whereas quantitative is big statistical analysis. We rely so much on statistics and large sample sizes now, which is not absurd either. It's not absurd, but there's place for both. And really, the Flexner Report was a big part of this because they touted observation as incomplete. That was a big thing of the Flexner Report. You can't go out and observe nature and learn, was essentially what they were trying to say. You can't go out and observe and learn. You need to do these scrutinous scientific experiments with controls and variables, but not actually control a natural environment, just control other factors. And science should be transparent, it should be coming to the general population, and it's not. It's simply not. Um, if you can't explain something to a 5-year-old, really, you're a poor scientist. If you can explain your work to a 5-year-old, you're a poor scientist. I'll stand by that. You should be able to explain what you talk about to so-called incompetent people, right? Science is not complicated. It's not. Science is just nature. It's just life. Anyone can understand it. Like, really, I can't stress that enough. Like, everyone is a scientist, but, we give these labels to people like, oh, experts, and, they're an expert of this or they're an expert of that. And it just puts people down and makes people feel like they can't go and research themselves. I'm telling you, that's not true. You can research things yourself. It's very important to understand because science is not transparent. One of the greatest things people ask me, what's the best thing you learned in university? I learned to be able to read the literature and to be able to criticize things. That was the best thing that I learned because I don't have to rely on someone else to tell me the information, you know? And I think it's ridiculous that we write these studies in terms that laymen can't understand because then we write these blog posts in layman terms and then it's someone's opinion. And, to avoid hypocrisy here, don't even listen to my opinion. Go and do it yourself. Go and read it yourself. That's the only way you're really going to prove something to yourself. You know, I certainly listened to a lot of podcasts, read a lot of books, but until I really proved things to myself, even beyond reading the literature, I went out and looked at things myself. I thought of things myself logically, rationally. That's the important thing here. And don't even listen to me. Don't listen to anybody on the internet. You're better off going and doing this stuff by yourself. So that's a good piece of advice for everything in life. Go and live your life and do things yourself. And if you think that living in fear from microbes is going to help you in any respect, even if microbes cause disease, it's not. Living in fear is just going to hurt you. So now my favorite topic, how polluted the literature is. I had some profs that would say this, and that's where I get the term from. They'd always say how polluted the literature is, and they would say to their students, don't pollute the literature. And I like those profs a lot. Those were my better profs. Um, it's important to look at the foundation of the widely accepted theories and dogmas, right? So that's why we're kind of doing this podcast today. We're looking at the foundation of the germ theory. We looked at the history. We looked at the reliant processes of it, such as electron microscopy, isolation, filtration, things of that nature. And when you look at the foundations and you understand that there's problems within the foundation, well, what happens when you build a house on a weak foundation? That house is coming down. And the germ theory is coming down. It certainly is. You could see it. And the thing is about the literature is new studies build upon old studies. And so you have these old studies, right? And this is the foundational aspect of it. You look at the old studies and they're not great. And even the thing is about today's new studies is when you read it and you go read the conclusion. And they're not very conclusive. They'll say most often they'll always say, well, further research needs to be done, or we'd love to confirm these results in another study. We'd love to confirm this variable in another study. These are all the potential variables. Let's do these in another study. And then you do another study and then five more variables come up. You do another study and 10 more variables come up. You know, the more you learn, the more you'll realize that you don't know shit. I've certainly realized that. And that's very true. And if you think otherwise, you're not learning. So the germ theory lies on a foundation of Pasteur, who was a fraud, Koch's postulates, who've never been attained in real life, although they are logical. And I can draw on another example is like the heart disease, being caused by things like cholesterol or saturated fat. Well, this really relies on a guy named Ansel Keys who done the 7 country studies, and he basically did this study, and he looked at these countries. He actually looked at 20 countries, took data from them all, plotted them out, found 7, provided a nice little linear line that goes up as saturated fat consumption increases, heart disease increases. So he cherry picked these 7 studies out of the 20 countries that he studied, plotted them, and said, well, here you go. Look at this correlation that equals causation in his mind that saturated fat is the cause of heart disease. Now, when you have truly controlled studies like Minnesota coronary or Sydney diet heart, who control the consumption of saturated fats versus polyunsaturated fats, there's certainly no indication that saturated fats are the cause of disease. But Ansel Keys is still touted as a pioneer in this area. We still take a 7 country study and reference it, even though we don't look at the Minnesota coronary or Sydney diet heart studies, which are much more conclusive studies than Ansel Keys' works. Ansel Keys is a absolute fraud, absolute terrible, terrible scientist, just to push the narrative of we need seed oils, and that goes back to the Industrial Revolution too, because throughout the Industrial Revolution, why do you think we created seed oils? They were used as lubricants in factories. It was a lubricant. And you know what? They had all of these seed oils that were made by this 15-step process of chemical isolation. That what were they going to do with it all? Well, Ansel Keys came out and said saturated fat's bad for you. We've eaten it for, millions and millions of years, but saturated fat's not good for you. It's going to give you heart disease. So you should try these seed oils. They're heart healthy. Margarine, heart healthy. Oh yeah, butter, don't eat that. That's going to give you heart disease. just an absolute foolish argument based on lies, based on a foundation of lies. It's absolute house of cards. It's really coming down with the whole carnivore movement, and people are really aware of this. And people are starting to just think for themselves. I feel like I think they push the COVID narrative a little much, and people are really thinking for themselves now. And they can think logically. If you think about it logically, well, we ate meat for I don't know how long, forever. So maybe we should try and eat more meat rather than avoid it. And so within the polluted literature, we obviously have political and ideological manipulation of it. This happens in every single establishment, and the literature is no exception. We push our ideologies and our dogma and our political affairs in the literature to try and make ourselves sound smarter and win the argument so we can win the political debate or we can push our ideologies forward. Just pollutes the literature. All right, we're going to move into talking a little bit about pharmaceuticals. Why do they seem to work? Well, pharmaceuticals do their job really well, but their job is not to heal you. Their job is to treat you. Their job is to remove symptoms, not to remove the cause of disease. And that's a really important distinction because no one's going to deny that. Um, you could take you take a Advil or Tylenol or, you know, and you feel a little less pain or you feel a little less, sick. You feel your fever breaks, goes away. But the problem is not addressing the true cause of disease, and that's really what I'm getting at here, right? Is we need to address the true causes of disease. We can't just remove the symptoms and think that we're healthy. Symptoms are not disease. Symptoms are our body's healing process. We should support them and not get rid of them. And that's really the big problem with pharmaceuticals is one, you're kind of avoid you're removing the communication of your body and your mind, right? You remove your physical symptoms of your body trying to tell yourself you need rest or you need this or that, and you can't perceive it anymore because you're then under the influence of these pharmaceutical drugs that suppress your symptoms. So that's why they seem to work. They don't work at healing, they work in treating. That's an important distinction. That's why the word treat is pretty much copyrighted for the medical community to use solely because they treat diseases, they don't heal diseases. Um, another thing about pharmaceutical companies or pharmaceutical drugs is really like our bodies are so delicate. Our microbiomes are so delicate. I really don't think that we understand the implication of these pharmaceutical drugs. We do studies on them, and if we study them and there are no symptoms presented in the majority of cases, obviously the outliers we have as side effects, we call them, when they're really direct effects, they just probably happen in more susceptible individuals. um, well, then they go to market, right? So, we study them, but we don't study them well enough. Antibiotics are an absolutely terrible pharmaceutical drug because really antibiotics are non-specific. They just decimate your microbiome of your gut. If you take antibiotics, you need to go on a gut protocol pretty heavily. Um, And that's not even some woo-woo conspiracy statement either. That's really, really in the mainstream view of things too. We kind of understand that. But antibiotics, really, you look at the root cause of the word, or the root of the word, right? The etiology. And anti meaning against, biotic meaning life. So they're really against life drugs. And they just decimate your microbiome. Like if you can avoid antibiotics, you should not take antibiotics. Um, you know, again, like, using my two-eyed seeing here, if you're going into sepsis and you're gonna die, well, then, you have to reconsider unless you want to die. So there is not like there are not emergency cases, but in general, you get a little cough or a little fever, you don't need antibiotics. Let your body heal. It will heal. Antibiotics might speed it up by a day. So it may be a little extra suffering, but you'll certainly reap the rewards and the benefits in the long run. So another thing in pharmaceutical drugs is vaccines. They're big money makers. They're cash cow. Now, Why are they giving us vaccines if they don't work? Well, there's heavy metals in it and they just increase our toxic load. It's just a surefire way of getting heavy metals lodged deeply within us to make it one hard to detox them and there are certainly diseases that come from heavy metal toxicity um that allow the pharmaceutical companies to sell more drugs. So that's one way of looking at it. And we talked about adjuvants quite a bit there. That's the known mainstream way of getting aluminum and mercury in vaccines. Although we've moved away from mercury and started moving just towards aluminum because it's so much healthier for you. So, immunization versus vaccination. Well, vaccination is not immunization. Um, Immunization, in my mind, would be exposing yourself to the environment, getting outside, playing in the dirt, playing with the dog, just exposing yourself to as much as you possibly can. Eat raw foods, eat raw meat, eat raw liver, drink raw milk. That's so good for you. Even the literature states that. So if you need that to, prove your own ideas, if you need the literature to to think, well, then look at that. You can find any studies, right? You can find studies that say that raw milk's gonna kill you because you're gonna get listeria or mad cow disease or something, but yeah, I'm sure those have gone under Koch's postulates. Um, Exposure to the environment, that's it. That's immunization. Vaccination is not immunization. Because even the need for an adjuvant kind of negates the whole idea, right? It's like, well, you can't just give me the bacteria or the virus. We have to give you this heavy metal to even stimulate the immune response. It's an absurdity. It's just absolute nonsense. So, what are the benefits of pharmaceutical drugs? Well, Hippocrates was touted as saying, for extreme diseases, extreme methods of cure, as to restriction, are most suitable. Now, my indigenous teachings, my two-eyed way of seeing things, is why I'm not here to take down any establishments. People living in the modern world who face absolutely debilitating diseases or possibly death from the modern diseases that are certainly caused by modern ways of life that are very present in and around us are going to require these types of treatments to live a comfortable life, right? So they create the disease, sell the cure. Now, if you're gonna abide by the modern way of life, you're gonna need modern cures for the most part. If you're looking for treatment, if you're looking for healing, always go the natural route. If you want to rid yourself of disease, truthfully, there's only one way to do that, and it's not through a practitioner. It's through yourself. So, like I said, like it's the emergency medicine that's the real benefit of these pharmaceutical companies. Like, the paramedics, they do great work, emergency docs, they do great work. That's where the benefits really lie, right? Um, because you're talking about emergencies, you're talking about people's lives here. And so that's a very important distinction. It's a two-eyed way of seeing things in my mind, and so that's why we're not here taking down the establishments. Not that they're going to be taken down because well, society certainly runs on drug money, whether you like it or not. Okay, and so fine, I think this might be the last slide. We have few more slides here, but we're kind of on the same topic for the end of it here. We're going to talk about contagion. Let's talk about the perceived contagion. Why have we come to this conclusion of contagion? Why is there this idea of contagion? Well, it's because of the environmental influence on our bodies. The external environment depicts our internal environment. Those in proximity to each other share similar environments. And so essentially, a whole family gets sick at once. Well, perhaps they have mold in their house. And not that mold is the cause of the disease, but mold on drywall or mold on building materials may aerosolize things like formaldehyde. So, And you can look at Dr. or Daniel Riota's work from Humanely on that. He certainly helped me understand uh, proposed fungal diseases more and mold diseases. But people who are in close proximity share similar environments. So I feel like that's really the main argument against the contagion. It's more of a contagion of environments and lifestyle. Same with the uh, heredity, right? So rather than pass down genetic diseases, we pass down poor lifestyle choices. I really think that's the driving factor because even epidemiology really doesn't align with heredity and genetic diseases. So the thing is, the host needs to have a toxic or deficient environment to host the pathogen, so-called pathogen, the so-called the microbe. So if you share these toxic environments, well, then it's likely that you'll have the same diseases or the same perceived diseases, right? So that's the real argument, I think, against why we have a perceived contagion. Um, Epidemiology likes to say that they prove contagion. Epidemiology is like the hymn of COVID, but epidemiology is only meant to generate hypothesis, but it's really a lot of people take it as evidence nowadays. You see all these blog posts and these news articles on epidemiology studies and them drawing conclusions. It's just nonsense. So what about things like scurvy, beriberi, pellagra, rickets, goiters? What about radiation or Hiroshima? These often happen in little cohorts. These often happens in cohort. They got scurvy was a contagious disease because everyone on the boat got scurvy all at once. Everyone on the boat. Imagine that. Except for the one guy who brought an orange or two with him. Um, and so this is the thing, right? Like all these diseases could be considered contagious until we found a true cause. And why do I say radiation? Well, look at Chernobyl. Well, everyone there had this disease. They all had this radiation disease. Well, it could have certainly been explained by a virus if people were stupid enough. Same as Hiroshima. Everyone had a lot of damage there. Why couldn't that be caused by a virus? No, that was a little insensitive, but it's true. It's like people getting sick all in one area. You can blame it on anything, really. You can blame it on different things. And so it's just like we have to look at the cause of things truthfully, right? Without pushing these dogmas. Um, the thing is too about contagion is now we have this asymptomatic nonsense. It started with AIDS, now it's in COVID. If you study AIDS, you'll realize COVID is just AIDS 2.0. The idea that people are asymptomatic and can still transfer the disease, another just fear tactic. And it actually aligns more with the terrain model of health because if you think about it, you can have these microbes in your body cleaning up your environment without producing a symptomatic response. And then you reach this certain threshold and you happen to have these larger detoxification symptoms, these self-healing processes. Um, it really aligns more with the terrain model than the germ theory nonsense. And really, like I think this is a good place to explore is the communication systems of bacteria and viruses. I really think that they're foundational to the communication of the body, right? We have 100 trillion bacteria in our body, more than our cells. We have 400 trillion viruses in our body. Like these can't be discounted. Like, and we have fungus in our body, we have parasites in our body, and they're all part of the natural way. So I think it's really important that we consider that. Um, and I think it'd be a good area to look in these communication systems because even it's part of the healing process, right? It can even signal our bodies. It signals our bodies, like the bacteria detects the disease environment, which in turn, you know, allows the immune system to have the response. The immune system is kind of a misnomer. We get on that in the next podcast. But it's the communication system, and I think that should be explored more too. And perhaps we can communicate with other people, and that might be an area of why we have a perceived contagion because, me being sick may trigger someone else to go into a detoxer at the same time. I don't think that's necessarily an absurd statement, and it doesn't necessarily dismantle the terrain model, and it certainly doesn't prove the germ theory. Uh, but that may be where the merging of both is where the half truth is, right? And things like cyclical things like the yearly flu, right? As it gets colder and people get outside less, people all tend to get sick around the same time, flu season. Well, that's only been around since 1889, and we'll talk about that in the next one too. So why is this widely accepted dogma? Why is the germ theory, why has it prevailed? Why? Well, really, Rockefeller and Carnegie were at the forefront. I think it's with the help of Pasteur. And those two guys, Rockefeller and Carnegie, they were businessmen, right? They wanted the pharmaceutical drugs derived from petroleum. It was cheap. They had it, they were in cahoots for sure. They funded the major universities to implement curriculum on the germ theory across the board. They also shut down a lot of universities, a lot of small scale universities. And now with the resurgence of small scale universities, all rely on these larger universities curriculums, right? Well, if Harvard's teaching germ theory and you're a small university starting up, you're not going to teach something else. You're going to teach the Harvard curriculum. You're not going to stray. Pasteur certainly on the scientific end kind of started things. He had vested interests for sure. He was a plagiarist, a fraud, a mediocre chemist, and a great politician. That's why that really happened. But he had ties with the emperor. I'm sure the emperor had ties with the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. It's not an absurd thing to think about. Um, Rivers was also a politician. The Flexner Report really perpetuated things that really monopolized the germ theory idea and the medicine idea, and that's really when the shutting down of many universities in the West was occurring. Bugs are blamed because they're at the site of infection. Correlation equals causation in this case, same as our good old boy Ansel Keys with saturated fats. Correlation equals causation, the biggest fallacy in modern science that we love to teach and hate to implement. As sanitation improves, infectious disease seem to disappear. You can look at, America's Industrial Revolution, new cities, countries currently without sewage have more infectious type diseases like cholera or malaria or things of that nature, even AIDS. And it's likely more because of the just toxic environments that they're living in, right? And a quick uh a quick aside here is the smallpox when the colonizers came over and the Native Americans. And if you read the book American Holocaust, you can kind of get a more accurate representation of what was truly going on. These Native Americans back in the day were living in these new mini cities, uh, where the waste, like human waste, was just running through the streets. It was not far from their homes. It was not far from where they would hunt or fish or do all that stuff too. So they were living in their waste. Not that waste is inherently bad, but the introduction of the colonizers' ways, the colonizers brought their shitty environments over. They brought their toxic environments over to the Native Americans. Um, and so that's an interesting to look at, right? Like I think the American Holocaust is a good read because it kind of does more justice to the Native Americans. I think the story that has been told, not that it's necessarily inaccurate, I just think that the colonizers have certainly tried to soften the blow. I think that we were a whole lot more ruthless than what's told in the mainstream. And I've certainly heard that from all the natives whom I've speak with. Uh, they certainly have more brutal stories than what's really put forth, especially in school curriculums. But that depends on the teacher too at the end of the day. And so another way that they can keep pushing this dogma is just changing the definitions. They love doing this. They changed the definition of vaccine during COVID. They changed it to incorporate the mRNA genetic therapy, because it used to be the inoculation of attenuated or whole live virus or microbe in a vaccine. But obviously, the mRNA genetic therapy doesn't contain a part of the microbe or virus. So they had to change the definition to be able to call the mRNA genetic therapy a vaccine because, well, without that, who wants to take something called genetic therapy? So they had to change the definition to put it in the same category of vaccines, but mRNA genetic therapy, the COVID-19, whatever injection is not a vaccine. And another way, they recharacterize diseases. They change the name of these symptom profiles and call them new diseases. That's happened a lot. Kind of see that with polio. And this happens in scientific ideas as well. You just change definitions, right? You change the definitions of this, or you don't abide by the definitions. Like you could see in isolation, we don't abide by true isolation definition, or pure. We don't abide by those definitions. We use them very loosely in modern science, and that's extremely problematic. Now, you know, I'm kind of a skeptic, I guess you could say. Um, Obviously, I don't think that I'm being absurd in thinking that there are vested interests in the world. I know that money runs the world. I know there are good-hearted people out there. Like those people become doctors and teachers. They don't become the ones at the top. Good-hearted people don't rise to the top and create curriculums or create, you know, frameworks for doctors to abide by. So it's not as though there's a lack of good-hearted people in the world, but the good-hearted people are not at the top, and that's certainly what I think. So I think it's more of a deception than a just a pure ignorance on these establishments, that perhaps they're incorrect. I think it's more of a plan than that. Um, because it all comes down to money, control, and power. That's what it is. That's what it's all about. And we have the whole population dependent on things like even chemical fertilizers. We have chemical foods, chemical drugs, chemical life. Our life is so chemical. Everything's made out of chemicals, plastics and petroleum derived cosmetics and all this stuff. It's just terrible. And we rely on it. And so we rely on these things that are giving us disease. So obviously we'll rely on the cure. It's never been the plan has never gone better than it has today. We've refined it over a very, very long time. And so obviously it all relies on fear. People are scared. People don't like getting diseases because it sucks, but we're not being told how to heal or prevent diseases properly. And that's I certainly am focusing more on the preventative aspects because prevention is the best medicine. And hopefully I'll appeal to more younger people, obviously, but it's never too late. And in prevention also is the healing processes. Now, like Hippocrates said, drastic diseases call for drastic measures, right? To paraphrase what he was saying. You can do natural methods drastically. There are things like coffee enemas or uh, even taking things like turpentines are more drastic ways of detox, but have certainly more drastic effects, especially if you're in a more disease state. But like I'm not a medical practitioner at all, and so I'd certainly consult with someone in that area. I do think that here we're more on the forefront of prevention than anything and trying to really understand our bodies so we can kind of know the inner workings of our bodies to become as healthy as possible, to be able to optimize our health and optimize other areas of our lives. And so, yeah, prevention is what we're all about here. That's what we're all about. Okay, and now for the reality of things. Pathogens do not exist in natural order. They only exist at the site of disease. Koch's postulates have never been proven, although they're still taught. Viruses have never been purely isolated. They've only been filtered. Uh, for that matter, bacteria have never been purely used in Koch's postulates either. Artifacts are never the whole picture. Follow the money, and you will find the truth. It's always comes down to the money, unfortunately. Greed drives the modern world, and it's a terrible thing. And really, greed is at the center of disease. Greed is certainly at the center of disease, and greed is not a natural thing. The Native Americans, when I learned to speak Mi'kmaq, which is the natives of my area where I live, when I learned their language actually in university, I learned that there was no word for jealousy before colonizers came over in the Mi'kmaq language. But when the colonizers came over and greed started to drive people, right? Unfortunately, the natives were taken by this. People started to become jealous, right? Greed and jealousy, they were not things. People were living optimally. They were living in abundance with less. And that's an important distinction because really greed and jealousy is central. And so funny enough, in the Mi'kmaq language now, after the colonizers, they changed the meaning of one of their words. And if you want to tell someone you're jealous in Mi'kmaq, you would say, "You smell like shit." So I kind of got a kick out of that because, you know, the elders still knew what was up. They still knew what was up for sure. Okay, so the next podcast we're going to do Follow the Germ, a history of the terrain model of health. It's likely going to be a two-parter. I worked on that lecture for a very, very long time. It's very long, so it's likely going to be a two-parter. We'll touch on the history in the first one, and then more go into the work into the bodies of the next one, and how all that works. So that's going to be a great podcast. I'm so looking forward to that. Um, but as for this one, we're all done for the day. So I want to thank you all for listening. You should all know that this is not medical advice. All this information is for general purposes only, general informational purposes only for legal reasons. But also remember that we are responsible, sovereign beings capable of thinking, criticizing, and understanding anything. We, the people and the greater forces, are together self-healers, self-governable, self-teachers, and so much more. Please reach out if you have any questions, comments, criticisms, or if you have any Koch's postulate studies that are complete. Uh, Reach me at beyond.terrain on Instagram. It'll be in the show notes. Listen, I truly appreciate every single person that took the time to listen to this podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast or found it informative in any way, please like, share, comment, and support and help me grow. Remember, there are two types of people in this world, those who believe they can and those who believe they can't, both of which are correct. Thanks for listening. Take care.